The Memoirs of Victor Hugo by Victor Hugo. Preface. This volume of memoirs has a double character, historical and intimate. The life of a period, the 19th century, is bound up in the life of a man, Victor Hugo. As we follow the events set forth, we get the impression they made upon the mind of the extraordinary man who recounts them, and, of all the personages he brings before us, he himself is assuredly not the least interesting. In Portraits from the Brushes of Rembrandt's there are always two portraits, that of the model and that of the painter. This is not a diary of events arranged in chronological order, nor is it a continuous autobiography. It is less and it is more, or rather, it is better than these. It is a sort of haphazard chronique in which only striking incidents and occurrences are brought out, and lengthy and wearisome details are avoided. Victor Hugo's long and checkered life was filled with experiences of the most diverse character: literature and politics, the court and the street, parliament and the theater, labor, struggles, disappointments, exile and triumphs. Hence we get a series of pictures of infinite variety. Let us pass the gallery rapidly in review. It opens in 1825, at Reims, during the coronation of Charles X, with an amusing _ on the manners and customs of the Restoration. The splendor of this coronation ceremony was singularly spoiled by the pitiable taste of those who had charge of it. These worthies took upon themselves to mutilate the sculpture work on the marvelous façade, and to embellish the austere cathedral with Gothic decorations of cardboard. The century, like the author, was young, and in some things both were incredibly ignorant. The masterpieces of literature were then unknown to the most learned underschoolers. Charles Nodier had never read the Romancero, and Victor Hugo knew little or nothing about Shakespeare. At the outset, the poet dominates in Victor Hugo. He belongs wholly to his creative imagination and to his literary work. It is the theater. It is his Cid and Hernani, with its stormy performances. It is the group of his actors, Émile Mars, Émile Georges, Frédéric Lemaitre, the French Kean with more genius. It is the Academy with its different kind of coteries. About this time Victor Hugo questions, anxiously and not in vain, a passerby who witnessed the execution of Louis XVI, and an officer who escorted Napoleon to Paris on his return from the island of Elba. Next, under the title, Visions of the Real, come some sketches in the master's best style of things seen in the mind's eye, as Hamlet says. Among them the hovel will attract attention. The sketch resembles a page from Edgar Poe, although it was written long before Poe's works were introduced into France. With Love in Prison, Victor Hugo deals with social questions in which he was more interested than in political questions. And yet, in entering the Chamber of Peers, he enters public life. His sphere is enlarged. He becomes one of the familiars of the Tuileries, Louis-Philippe Verbose, and full of recollections that he is fond of imparting to others, seeks the company and appreciation of this listener of note, and makes all sorts of confidences to him. The king, with his very haughty bonhomie and his somewhat infatuated wisdom, the grave and sweet Duchess d'Orleans, the boisterous and amiable princes, the whole commonplace and homelike court are depicted with kindliness but sincerity. The horizon, however, grows dark, and from 1846 the new peer of France notes the gradual tottering of the edifice of royalty. The Revolution of 1848 bursts out. Nothing could be more thrilling than the account, hour by hour, of the events of the 3 days of February. Victor Hugo is not merely a spectator of this great drama, he is an actor in it. He is in the streets, he makes speeches to the people, he seeks to restrain them. He believes, with too good reason, that the Republic is premature, and, in the Place de la Bastille, before the evolutionary Faubourg Saint-Antoine, he dares to proclaim the Regency. 4 months later, distress provokes the formidable insurrection of June, which is fatal to the Republic. The year 1848 is the stormy year. The atmosphere is fiery, men are violent, events are tragical. Battles in the streets are followed by fierce debates in the Assembly. Victor Hugo takes part in the melee. We witness the scenes with him. He points out the chief actors to us. His sketches made in the National Assembly are sketched from life in the fullest acceptation of the term. 20 lines suffice. Odilon Barrett and Chain Garnier, Prud'hon and Blanqui, Lamartine and Monsieur Chair, come, go, speak, veritable living figures. The most curious of the figures is Louis Bonaparte when he arrived in Paris and when he assumed the presidency of the Republic. He is gauche, affected, somewhat ridiculous, distrusted by the Republicans, and scoffed at by the Royalists. Nothing could be more suggestive or more piquant than the inauguration dinner at the Élysée, at which Victor Hugo was one of the guests, and the first in courteous relations between the author of Napoleon the Little and the future emperor who was to inflict 20 years of exile upon him. But now we come to the year which Victor Hugo has designated the terrible year, the war and the siege of Paris. This part of the volume is made up of extracts from notebooks, private and personal notes, dotted down from day to day, which is to say that they do not constitute an account of the oft-related episodes of the siege but tell something new, the little side of great events, the little incidents of everyday life, the number of shells fired into the city and what they cost, the degrees of cold, the price of provisions, what is being said, sung, and eaten, and at the same time give the psychology of the great city, its illusions, revolts, wrath, anguish, and also its gaiety, for during these long months Paris never gave up hope and preserved an heroic cheerfulness. On the other hand, a painful note runs through the diary kept during the meeting of the Assembly at Bordeaux. France is not only vanquished, she is mutilated. The conqueror demands a ransom of milliards. It is his right, the right of the strongest, but he tears from her 2 provinces, with their inhabitants devoted to France. It is a return towards barbarism. Victor Hugo withdraws indignantly from the Assembly which has agreed to endorse the Treaty of Frankfurt, and 3 days after his resignation he sees Charles Hugo, his eldest son, die a victim to the privations of the siege. He is stricken at once in his love of country and in his paternal love, and one can say that in these painful pages, more than in any of the others, the book is history that has been lived. Paul Maurice. Paris, September 15, 1899. At Reims. 1823 to 1838. It was at Reims that I heard the name of Shakespeare for the first time. It was pronounced by Charles Nodier. That was in 1825 during the coronation of Charles X. No one at that time spoke of Shakespeare quite seriously. Voltaire's ridicule of him was law. Madame de Staël had adopted Germany, the great land of Kant, of Schiller, and of Beethoven. Ducis was at the height of his triumph. He and Delille were seated side by side in academic glory, which is not unlike theatrical glory. Ducis had succeeded in doing something with Shakespeare. He had made him possible. He had extracted some tragedies from him. Ducis impressed one as being a man who could chisel an Apollo out of Moloch. It was the time when Iago was called Pizarre, Horatio Nercest, and Desdemona Hadelmone. A charming and very witty woman, the Duchess de Duras, used to say, "Desdemona, what an ugly fille." Talma, Prince of Denmark, in a tunic of lilac satin trimmed with fur, used to exclaim, "Avaunt, dread spectre." The poor spectre, in fact, was only tolerated behind the scenes. If it had ventured to put in the slightest appearance, Évariste Dumoulin would have given it a severe talking to. Some genin or other would have hurled at it the first cobblestone he could lay his hand on. A line from Boileau, under l'esprit n'est point ému de ce qui ne croit pas. It was replaced on the stage by an urn that Talma carried under his arm. A spectre is ridiculous. Ashes, that's the style. Are not the ashes of Napoleon still spoken of? Is not the translation of the coffin from St. Helena to the Invalids alluded to as the return of the ashes? As to the witches of Macbeth, they were rigorously barred. The hall porter of the Théâtre Français had his orders. They would have been received with their own brooms. I am mistaken, however, in saying that I did not know Shakespeare. Knew him as everybody else did, not having read him and having treated him with ridicule. My childhood began as everybody's childhood begins, with prejudices. Man finds prejudices beside his cradle, puts them from him a little in the course of his career, and often, alas, takes to them again in his old age. During this journey in 1825, Charles Nodier and I passed our time recounting to each other the Gothic tales and romances that have taken root in Reims. Our memories and sometimes our imaginations clubbed together. Each of us furnished his legend. Reims is one of the most impossible towns in the geography of story. Pagan lords have lived there, one of whom gave as a dower to his daughter the strips of land in Borysthenes called the race courses of Achilles. The Duke de Guyenne, in the Fabliaux, passes through Rheims on his way to besiege Babylon. Babylon, moreover, which is very worthy of Rheims, is the capital of the Admiral Godicius. It is at Rheims that the deputation sent by the Lacri Ozoli to Apollonius of Tyana, high priest of Bologna, disembarks. While discussing this disembarkation we argued concerning the Lacri Ozoli. These people, according to Nodier, were called the Fetidi because they were half monkeys, according to myself because they inhabited the marshes of Phocis. We reconstructed on the spot the tradition of Saint Remigius and his adventures with the fairy Maislane. The Champagne country is rich in tales. Nearly all the old Gaulish fables had their origin in this province. Rheims is the land of chimeras. It is perhaps for this reason that kings were crowned there. Legends are so natural to this place, are in such good soil that they immediately began to germinate upon the coronation of Charles X itself. The Duke of Northumberland, the representative of England at the coronation ceremonies, was reputed fabulously wealthy. Wealthy and English, how could he be otherwise than under la mode unders? The English at that period were very popular in French society, although not among the people. They were liked in certain salons because of Waterloo, which was still fairly recent, and to anglicize the French language was a recommendation in ultra-fashionable society. Lord Northumberland, therefore, long before his arrival, was popular and legendary in Rheims. A coronation was a godsend to Rheims. A flood of opulent people inundated the city. It was the Nile that was passing. Landlords rubbed their hands with glee. There was in Rheims in those days, and there probably is today, at the corner of a street giving on to the square, a rather large house with a carriage entrance and a balcony, built of stone in the royal style of Louis XIV, and facing the cathedral. About this house and Lord Northumberland the following was related. In January 1825, the balcony of the house bore the notice, "House for sale." All at once the Moniteur announced that the coronation of Charles X would take place at Rheims in the spring. There was great rejoicing in the city. Notices of rooms to let were immediately hung out everywhere. The meanest room was to bring in at least 60 francs a day. One morning a man of irreproachable appearance, dressed in black, with a white cravat, an Englishman who spoke broken French, presented himself at the house in the square. He saw the proprietor, who eyed him attentively. "You wish to sell your house?" queried the Englishman. "How much?" "10,000 francs. "But I don't want to buy it." "What do you want then?" "Only to hire it." "That's different." "For a year?" "For 6 months." "No. I want to hire it for 3 days." "How much will you charge?" "30,000 francs. The gentleman was Lord Northumberland's steward, who was looking for a lodging for his master for the coronation ceremonies. The proprietor had smelled the Englishman and guessed the steward. The house was satisfactory, and the proprietor held out for his price. The Englishman, being only a Norman, gave way to the Champenois. The Duke paid the 30,000 francs and spent 3 days in the house at the rate of 400 francs an hour. Nodier and I were 2 explorers. When we traveled together, as we occasionally did, we went on voyages of discovery, he in search of rare books, I in search of ruins. He would go into ecstasies over _symbolum, mound with margins, and I over a defaced portal. We had given each other a devil. He said to me, "You are possessed of the demon Ogive." "And you?" I answered, "of the demon Elzevir." At Soissons, while I was exploring Saint-Jean-de-Vigne, he had discovered in a suburb a ragpicker. The ragpicker's basket is the hyphen between rags and paper, and the ragpicker is the hyphen between the beggar and the philosopher. Nodier, who gave to the poor and sometimes to philosophers, had entered the ragpicker's abode. The ragpicker turned out to be a book dealer. Among the books Nodier noticed a rather thick volume of 600 or 800 pages, printed in Spanish, 2 columns to a page, badly damaged by worms and the binding missing from the back. The ragpicker asked what he wanted for it, replied, trembling lest the price should be refused, 5 francs, which Nodier paid, also trembling but with joy. This book was the Romancero complete. There are only 3 complete copies of this edition now in existence. One of these a few years ago sold for 7,500 francs. Moreover, worms are vying with each other and eating up these 3 remaining copies. The people's feeders of princes have something else to do than spend their money to preserve for new editions the legacies of human intellect, and the _romancero_ being merely an Iliad has not been reprinted. During the 3 days of the coronation there were great crowds in the streets of Reims, at the Archbishop's palace, and on the promenades along the Vestra, eager to catch a glimpse of Charles X. I said to Charles Nodier, "Let us go and see His Majesty the Cathedral." Reims is a proverb in Gothic Christian art. One speaks of the nave of Amiens, the bell towers of Chartres, the façade of Reims. Before the coronation of Charles X, a swarm of masons, perched on ladders and clinging to knotted ropes, spent a week smashing with hammers every bit of jutting sculpture on the façade, for fear a stone might become detached from one of these reliefs and fall on the king's head. The debris littered the pavement and was swept away. For a long time I had in my possession a head of Christ that fell in this way. It was stolen from me in 1851. This head was unfortunate, broken by a king. It was lost by an exile. Nodier was an admirable antiquary, and we explored the cathedral from top to bottom, encumbered though it was with scaffolding, painted scenery, and stage-side lights. The nave being only of stone, they had hidden it by an edifice of cardboard, doubtless because the latter bore a greater resemblance to the monarchy of that period. For the coronation of the King of France they had transformed a church into a theatre, and it has since been related, with perfect accuracy, that on arriving at the entrance I asked of the bodyguard on duty, "Where is my box?" This cathedral of Reims is beautiful above all cathedrals. On the façade are kings, on the apses people being put to the torture by executioners. Coronation of kings with an accompaniment of victims. The façade is one of the most magnificent symphonies ever sung by that music architecture. One dreams for a long time before this oratorio. Looking up from the square you see at a giddy height, at the base of the 2 towers, a row of gigantic statues representing kings of France. Their hands they hold the scepter, the sword, the hand of justice, and the globe, and on their heads are antique open crowns with bulging gems. It is superb and grim. You push open the bell ringer's door, climb the winding staircase, the screw of St. Giles, to the towers, to the high regions of prayer. You look down and the statues are below you. The row of kings is plunging into the abysm. You hear the whispering of the enormous bells, which vibrate at the kiss of vague zephyrs from the sky. One day I gazed down from the top of the tower through an embrasure. The entire façade sheered straight below me. I perceived in the depth, on top of a long stone support that extended down the wall directly beneath me to the escarpment, so that its form was lost, a sort of round basin. Rainwater had collected there and formed a narrow mirror at the bottom. There were also a tuft of grass with flowers in it, and a swallow's nest. Thus in a space only 2 feet in diameter were a lake, a garden, and a habitation, a bird's paradise. As I gazed the swallow was giving water to her brood. Round the upper edge of the basin were what looked like crenelles, and between these the swallow had built her nest. I examined these crenelles. They had the form of fleurs de lis. The support was a statue. This happy little world was the stone crown of an old king. And if God were asked, of what use was this Lothario, this Philip, this Charles, this Louis, this emperor, this king? God peradventure would reply, he had this statue made and lodged a swallow. The coronation occurred. This is not the place to describe it. Besides, my recollections of the ceremony of May 27, 1825, have been recounted elsewhere by another more ably than I could set them forth. Suffice it to say that it was a radiant day. God seemed to have given his assent to the fate. The long clear windows, for there are no more stained glass windows at Reims, let in bright daylight. All the light of May was in the church. The archbishop was covered with gilding, and the altar with rays. Marshal de Lauriston, minister of the king's household, rejoiced at the sunshine. He came and went as busy as could be, and conversed in low tones with Lecointe and Hittorf, the architects. The fine morning afforded the occasion to say, the son of the coronation, as one used to say, the son of Austerlitz. And in the resplendent light a profusion of lamps and tapers found means to beam. At one moment Charles X, attired in a cherry-colored samar striped with gold, lay at full length at the archbishop's feet. The peers of France on the right, embroidered with gold, beplumed in the Henri IV style and wearing long mantles of velvet and ermine, and the deputies on the left, in dress coats of blue cloth with silver fleurs de lis on the collars, looked on. About all the forms of chance were represented there: the papal benediction by the cardinals, some of whom had witnessed the coronation of Napoleon; victory by the marshals; heredity by the Duc d'Angoulême; Dauphin; happiness by M. de Talleyrand, lame but able to get about; the rising and falling of stocks by M. de Villèle; joy by the birds that were released and flew away; and the knaves in a pack of playing cards by the four heralds. A vast carpet embroidered with fleurs de lis, made expressly for the occasion and called the coronation carpet, covered the old flagstones from one end of the cathedral to the other and concealed the tombstones. In the pavement, thick, luminous smoke of incense filled the nave. The birds that had been set at liberty flew wildly about in this cloud. The king changed his costume 6 or 7 times. The first prince of the blood, Louis Philippe, Duc d'Orléans, aided him. The Duc de Bordeaux, who was 5 years old, was in a gallery. The pew in which Nodier and I were seated adjoined those of the deputies. In the middle of the ceremony, just before the king prostrated himself at the feet of the archbishop, a deputy for the department, named M. Himonin, turned towards Nodier, who was close to him, and with his finger on his lips, as a sign that he did not wish to disturb the archbishop's orisons by speaking, slipped something into my friend's hand. This something was a book. Nodier took it and glanced over it. "What is it?" I whispered. "Nothing very precious," he replied. "An odd volume of Shakespeare. Glasgow edition. One of the tapestries from the treasure of the church hanging exactly opposite to us represented a not very historical interview between John Lackland and Philip Augustus." Nodier turned over the leaves of the book for a few minutes, then pointed to the tapestry. "You see that tapestry?" "Yes." "Do you know what it represents?" "No." "John Lackland." "Well, what of it?" "John Lackland is also in this book." The volume, which was in sheep binding and worn at the corners, was indeed a copy of King John under Himonin turned to Nodier and said, "I paid 6 sous for it." In the evening the Duke of Northumberland gave a ball. It was a magnifique, fairy-like spectacle. This Arabian Nights ambassador brought one of these nights to Reims. Every woman found a diamond in her bouquet. I could not dance. Nodier had not danced since he was 16 years of age, when a great aunt went into ecstasies over his terpsichorean efforts and congratulated him in the following terms: "Understand, tu danses comme Rimchou." We did not go to Lord Northumberland's ball. "What shall we do tonight?" said I to Nodier. He held up his odd volume and answered, "Let us read this." We read. That is to say, Nodier read. He knew English without being able to speak it, I believe, enough to make it out. He read aloud and translated as he read. At intervals while he rested, I took the book, bought from the ragpicker of Soissons, and read passages from the Romancero. Like Nodier, I translated as I read. We compared the English with the Castilian book. We confronted the dramatic with the Nodier stood up for Shakespeare, whom he could read in English, and I for the Romancero, which I could read in Spanish. We brought face to face, he the bastard Falconbridge, I the bastard Madara. And little by little, in contradicting, we convinced each other, and Nodier became filled with enthusiasm for the Romancero and I with admiration for Shakespeare. Listeners arrived. One passes the evening as best one can in a provincial town on a coronation day when one doesn't go to the ball. We formed quite a little club. There was an academician, M. Roger, a man of letters, M. d'Eckstein, M. de Marcellus, friend and country neighbor of my father, who poked fun at his royalism, and mine, good old Marquis de Herboville, and M. Himonin, donor of the book that cost 6 sous. "It isn't worth the money," exclaimed M. Roger. The conversation developed into a debate. Judgment was passed upon John de Marcellus declared that the assassination of Arthur was an improbable incident. It was pointed out to him that it was a matter of history. It was with difficulty that he became reconciled to it. For kings to kill each other was impossible. To M. de Marcellus's mind, the Murdering of kings began on January 21st. Regicide was synonymous with 93. To kill a king was an unheard of thing that the populace, alone, were capable of doing. No king except Louis XVI had ever been violently put to death. He, however, reluctantly admitted the case of Charles. In his death also he saw the hand of the populace. All the rest was demagogic lying and calumny. Although as good a royalist as he, I ventured to insinuate that the 16th century had existed, and that it was the period when the Jesuits had clearly propounded the question of bleeding the basilic vein, that is to say of cases in which the king ought to be slain. A question which, once brought forward, met with such success that it resulted in two kings, Henry III and Henry IV, being stabbed and a Jesuit, Father Guignard, being hanged. Then we passed to the details of the drama, situations, scenes, and personages. Notier pointed out that Falconbridge is the same person, spoken of by Matthew Paris as Falcasius de Trente, bastard of Richard Coeur de Lion. Baron d'Eckstein, in support of this, reminded his hearers that, according to Holinshed, Falconbridge, or Falcasius, slew the Viscount de Limoges to avenge his father Richard, who had been wounded unto death at the siege of Chaluz, and that this castle of Chaluz being the property of the Viscount de Limoges, it was only right that the Viscount, although absent, should be made to answer with his head for the falling of an arrow or a stone from the castle upon the king. Roger laughed at the cry of Austria Limoges in the play and at Shakespeare's confounding the Viscount de Limoges with the Duke of Austria. Roger scored the success of the evening in his laughter. Settled the matter. The discussion having taken this turn, I said nothing further. This revelation of Shakespeare had moved me. His grandeur impressed me. King John is not a masterpiece, but certain scenes are lofty and powerful, and in the Motherhood of Constance there are bursts of genius. The two books, open and reversed, remained lying upon the table. The company had ceased to read in order to laugh. Notier at length became silent like myself. We were beaten. The gathering broke up with a laugh, and our visitors went away. Notier and I remained alone and pensive, thinking of the great works that are unappreciated, and amazed that the intellectual education of the civilized peoples, and even our own, his and mine, had advanced no further than this. At last Notier broke the silence. I can see his smile now as he said, "They know nothing about the romancero." I replied, "And they deride Shakespeare." 13 years later chance took me to Reims again. It was on August 28, 1838. It will be seen further on why this date impressed itself on my memory. I was returning from Vuziers, and seeing the two towers of Reims in the distance, was seized with a desire to visit the cathedral again. Therefore went to Reims. On arriving in the cathedral square I saw a gun drawn up near the portal, and beside it gunners with lighted fuses in their hands, as I had seen artillery there on May 27, 1825. I supposed it was customary to keep a cannon in the square and paid little attention to it. I passed on and entered the church. A beadle in violet sleeves, a sort of priest, took me in charge and conducted me all over the church. The stones were dark, the statues dismal, the altar mysterious. No lamps competed with the sun. The latter threw upon the sepulchral stones in the pavement the long white silhouettes of the windows, which threw the melancholy obscurity of the rest of the church looked like phantoms lying upon these tombs. No one was in the church. Not a whisper, not a footfall could be heard. This solitude saddened the heart and enraptured the soul. There were in it abandonment, neglect, oblivion, exile, and sublimity. Gone the whirl of 1825. The church had resumed its dignity and its calmness. Not a piece of finery, not a vestment, not anything. It was bare and beautiful. The lofty vault no longer supported a canopy. Ceremonies of the palace are not suited to these severe places. A coronation ceremony is merely tolerated. These noble ruins are not made to be courtiers. To rid it of the throne and withdraw the king from the presence of God increases the majesty of a temple. Louis XIV hides Jehovah from sight. Withdraw the priest as well. All that eclipsed it having been taken away, you will see the light of day direct. Orisons, rites, Bibles, formulas refract and decompose the sacred light. A dogma is a dark chamber. Through a religion you see the solar specter of God, but not God. Desuetude and crumbling enhance the grandeur of a temple. Human religion retires from this mysterious and jealous edifice, divine religion enters it. Let solitude reign in it and you will feel heaven. There. A sanctuary deserted and in ruins like Jumiages like St. Bertin like Villars like Holyrood like Montrose Abbey like the Temple of Paestum like the Hypogeum of Thebes becomes almost an element and possesses the virginal and religious grandeur of a savanna or of a forest. There's something of the real presence is to be found. Such places are truly holy. Man has meditated and communed with himself therein. What they contained of truth has remained and become greater. The _epupres_ has no longer any voice. Extinct dogmas have not left their ashes. The prayer of the past has left its perfume. There is something of the absolute in prayer, and because of this, that which was a synagogue, that which was a mosque, that which was a pagoda, is venerable. A stone on which that great anxiety that is called prayer has left its impress is never treated with ridicule by the thinker. The trace left by those who have bowed down before the infinite is always imposing. In strolling about the cathedral I had climbed to the triforium, then under the arched buttresses, then to the top of the edifice. The timber work under the pointed roof is admirable, but less remarkable than the forest of Amiens. It is of chestnut wood. These cathedral attics are of grim appearance. One could almost lose oneself in the labyrinths of rafters, squares, traverse beams, superposed joists, traves, architraves, girders, madriers, and tangled lines and curves. One might imagine oneself to be in the skeleton of Babel. The place is as bare as a garret and as wild as a cavern. The wind whistles mournfully through it. Rats are at home there. The spiders, driven from the timber by the odor of chestnut, make their home in the stone of the basement where the church ends and the roof begins, and low down in the obscurity spin their webs in which you catch your face. One respires a mysterious dust, and the centuries seem to mingle with one's breath. The dust of churches is not like the dust of houses. It reminds one of the tomb. It is composed of ashes. The flooring of these colossal garrets has crevices in it through which one can look down into the abysm, the church below. In the corners that one cannot explore are pools of shadow, as it were. Birds of prey enter through one window and go out through the other. Lightning is also familiar with these high, mysterious regions. Sometimes it ventures too near, and then it causes the conflagration of Rouen, of Chartres, or of St. Paul's, London. My guide, the beetle, preceded me. He looked at the dung on the floor and tossed his head. He knew the bird by its manure and growled between his teeth. This is a rook, this is a hawk, this is an owl. You ought to study the human heart, said I. A frightened bat flew before us. While walking almost at hazard, following this bat, looking at this manure of the birds, respiring this dust, in this obscurity among the cobwebs and scampering rats, we came to a dark corner in which, on a big wheelbarrow, I could just distinguish a long package tied with string. And that looked like a piece of rolled-up cloth. What is that? I asked the beetle. That, said he, is Charles X's coronation carpet. I stood gazing at the thing, and as I did so I am telling truthfully. What occurred? There was a deafening report that sounded like a thunderclap, only it came from below. It shook the timber work and echoed and re-echoed through the church. It was succeeded by a second roar, then a third at regular intervals. I recognized the thunder of the cannon and remembered the gun I had seen in the square. I turned to my guide. What is that noise? The telegraph has been at work and the cannon has been fired. What does it mean? I continued. It means, said the beetle, that a grandson has just been born to Louis Philippe. The cannon announced the birth of the Count de Paris. These are my recollections of Reims, recounted by eyewitnesses. I. The execution of Louis XVI. 2. The arrival of Napoleon I in Paris in 1815. I. The execution of Louis XVI. There were certain characteristic details connected with the execution of Louis XVI that are not recorded in history. They were recounted to me by an eyewitness * and are here published for the first time. * This eyewitness was one Leboucher, who arrived in Paris from Bourges in December 1792 and was present at the execution of Louis XVI. In 1840 he recounted to Victor Hugo. Most of these details, which, as can easily be imagined, had impressed themselves deeply upon his mind. The scaffold was not, as is generally believed, erected in the very center of the place on the spot where the obelisk now stands, but on a spot which the decree of the Provisional Executive Council designates in these precise terms, between the Pied d'Estel and the Champs-Élysées. What was this pedestal? Present generations who have seen so many things happen, so many statues crumble and so many pedestals overthrown do not quite know what meaning to give to this very vague designation, and would be embarrassed to tell for what monument the mysterious stone, which the Executive Council of the Revolution laconically calls the Pied d'Estel, served as a base. This stone had borne the statue of Louis XV. Let it be noted understood that this strange place, which had been called successively the Place Louis XV, Place de la Révolution, Place de la Concorde, Place Louis XVI, Place du Garde-Meuble and Place des Champs-Élysées, and which could not retain any name, could not keep any monument either. It has had the statue of Louis XV, which disappeared. An expiatory fountain which was to have laved the bloody center of the place was projected, but not even the first stone was laid. A rough model of a monument to the charter was made. We have never seen anything but the socle of this monument, just when a bronze figure representing the charter of 1814 was about to be erected. The Revolution of July arrived with the charter of 1830. The pedestal of Louis XVIII vanished, as fell the pedestal of Louis XV. Now on this same spot we have placed the obelisk of Sesostris. It required 30 centuries for the great desert to engulf half of it. How many years will the Place de la Revolution require to swallow it up altogether? In the year 2 of the Republic, what the Executive Council called the Pied d'Estel was not but a shapeless and hideous block. It was a sort of sinister symbol of the royalty itself. Its ornaments of marble and bronze had been wrenched off. The bare stone was everywhere split and cracked. On the 4 sides were large square gaps showing the places where the destroyed bas reliefs had been. Scarcely could a remnant of the entablature still be distinguished at the summit of the pedestal, and beneath the cornice a string of ovulos, defaced and worn, was surmounted by what architects call a chaplet of paternosters. On the table of the pedestal one could perceive a heap of debris of all kinds, in which tufts of grass were growing here and there. This pile of nameless things had replaced the royal statue. The scaffold was raised a few steps distant from this ruin, a little in rear of it. It was covered with long planks laid transversely that masked the framework. A ladder without banisters or balustrade was at the back, and what they venture to call the head of this horrible construction was turned towards the garde-meuble. A basket of cylindrical shape, covered with leather, was placed at the spot where the head of the king was to fall to receive it, and at one of the angles of the entablature, to the right of the ladder, could be discerned a long wicker basket prepared for the body, and on which one of the executioners, while waiting for the king, had laid his hat. Imagine now, in the middle of the place, these two lugubrious things, a few paces from each other, the pedestal of Louis XV and the scaffold of Louis XVI. That is to say, the ruins of royalty dead and the martyrdom of royalty living. Around these two things 4 formidable lines of armed men, preserving a great empty square in the midst of an immense crowd. To the left of the scaffold, the Champs-Élysées; to the right, the Tuileries, which, neglected and left at the mercy of the public, had become an unsightly waste of dirt heaps and trenches, and over these melancholy edifices, over these black, leafless trees, over this gloomy multitude, the bleak, somber sky of a winter morning, and one will have an idea of the aspect which the Place de la Révolution presented at the moment when Louis XVI, in the carriage of the mayor of Paris, dressed in white, the Book of Psalms clasped in his hands, arrived there to die. At a few minutes after 10 o'clock on January 21, 1793. Strange excess of abasement and misery, the son of so many kings, bound and sacred like the kings of Egypt, was to be consumed between 2 layers of quicklime, and to this French royalty, which at Versailles had a throne of gold and at St. Denis 60 sarcophagi of granite, there remained but a platform of pine and a wicker coffin. Here are some unknown details. The executioners numbered 4, 2 only performed the execution, the 3rd stayed at the foot of the ladder, and the 4th was on the wagon which was to convey the king's body to the Madeleine Cemetery, and which was waiting a few feet from the scaffold. The executioners wore breeches, coats in the French style as the Revolution had modified it, and three-cornered hats with enormous tricolor cockades. They executed the king with their hats on, and it was without taking his hat off that Samson, seizing by the hair the severed head of Louis XVI, showed it to the people and for a few moments let the blood from it trickle upon the scaffold. At the same time his valet or assistant undid what were called les sangless straps, and while the crowd gazed alternately upon the king's body dressed entirely in white as I have said and still attached with the hands bound behind the back to the swing board, and upon that head whose kind and gentle profile stood out against the misty, somber trees of the Tuileries, two priests, commissaries of the Commune, instructed to be present as municipal officials at the execution of the king, sat in the mayor's carriage, laughing and conversing in loud tones. One of them, Jacques Roux, derisively drew the other's attention to Capet's fat calves and abdomen. The armed men who surrounded the scaffold had only swords and pikes. There were very few muskets. Most of them wore large round hats or red caps. A few platoons of mounted dragoons in uniform were mingled with these troops at intervals. A whole squadron of dragoons was ranged in battle array beneath the terraces of the Tuileries. What was called the Battalion of Marseilles formed one of the sides of the square. The guillotine. It is always with repugnance that one writes this hideous word would appear to the craftsman of today to be very badly constructed. The knife was simply suspended to a pulley fixed in the center of the upper beam. This pulley and a rope the thickness of a man's thumb constituted the whole apparatus. The knife, which was not very heavily weighted, was of small dimensions and had a curved edge, which gave it the form of a reversed Phrygian cap. No hood was placed to shelter the king's head and at the same time to hide and circumscribe its fall. All that crowd could see the head of Louis XVI drop in it was thanks to chance, thanks perhaps to the smallness of the knife which diminished the violence of the shock, that it did not bound beyond the basket to the pavement. Terrible incident which often occurred at executions during the Terror. Nowadays assassins and poisoners are decapitated more decently. Many improvements in the guillotine have been made. At the spot where the king's head fell, a long rivulet of blood streamed down the planks of the scaffold to the pavement. When the execution was over, Samson threw to the people the king's coat, which was of white moll-eaten, and in an instant it disappeared, torn by 1,000 hands. At the moment when the head of Louis XVI fell, the Abbé Edgeworth was still near the king. The blood spurt upon him. He hastily donned a brown overcoat, descended from the scaffold and was lost in the crowd. The first row of spectators opened before him with a sort of wonder, mingled with respect, but after he had gone a few steps, the attention of everybody was still so concentrated upon the center of the place, where the event had just been accomplished, that nobody took any further notice of Abbé Edgeworth. The poor priest, enveloped in his thick coat which concealed the blood with which he was covered, fled in bewilderment, walking as one in a dream and scarcely knowing where he was going. However, with that sort of instinct which preserves somnambulists, he crossed the river, took the Rue du Bac, then the Rue du Regard, and thus managed to reach the house of Madame de Lézardière, near the Barrière du Maine. Arrived there, he divested himself of his soiled clothing and remained for several hours in a state of collapse, without being able to collect a thought or utter a word. Some royalists who rejoined him, and who had witnessed the execution, surrounded the Abbé Edgeworth and reminded him of the adieu he had addressed to the king, "Son of St. Louis, ascend to heaven." Words, however memorable though they were, had left no trace on the mind of him who had uttered them. "We heard them," said the witnesses of the catastrophe, still moved and thrilled. "It is possible," he replied, "but I do not remember having said such a thing." Abbé Edgeworth lived a long life without ever being able to remember whether he really did pronounce these words. Madame de Lézardière, who had been seriously ill for more than a month, was unable to support the shock of the death of Louis XVI. She died on the very night of January 21st. 2. Arrival of Napoleon, Indiana, Paris. March 20, 1815. History and contemporaneous memoirs have truncated or badly related or even omitted altogether certain details of the arrival of the emperor in Paris on March 20, 1815. But living witnesses are to be met with who saw them and who rectify or complete them. During the night of the 19th, the emperor left senators. He arrived at 3 o'clock in the morning at Fontainebleau. Towards 5 o'clock as day was breaking, he reviewed the few troops he had taken with him and those who had rallied to him at Fontainebleau itself. They were of every corps, of every regiment, of all arms, a little of the Grand Army, a little of the Guard. At 6 o'clock, the review being over, 120 lancers mounted their horses and went on ahead to wait for him at Essens. These lancers were commanded by Colonel Galbois, now Lieutenant General, and who has recently distinguished himself at Constantine. They had been at Essens scarcely 3/4 of an hour, resting their horses, when the carriage of the Emperor arrived. The escort of lancers were in their saddles in the twinkling of an eye and surrounded the carriage, which immediately started off again without having changed horses. The Emperor stopped on the way at the large villages to receive petitions from the inhabitants and the submission of the authorities, and sometimes to listen to harangues. He was on the rear seat of the carriage, with General Bertrand in full uniform seated on his left. Colonel Galbois galloped beside the door on the Emperor's side. The door on Bertrand's side was guarded by a quartermaster of lancers named Ferrez, today a wine-shop keeper at Puteaux, a former and very brave hussar whom the Emperor knew personally and addressed by name. No one on the road approached the Emperor. Everything that was intended for him passed through General Bertrand's hands. 3 or 4 leagues beyond Essens, the imperial cortege found the road suddenly barred by General Colbert at the head of 2 squadrons and 3 regiments echeloned towards Paris. General Colbert had been the colonel of the regiment of lancers from which the detachment that escorted the Emperor had been drawn. He recognized his lancers, and his lancers recognized him. They cried, "General, come over to us." The general answered, "My children, do your duty, I am doing mine." Then he turned rein and went off to the right, across country, with a few mounted men who followed him. He could not have resisted. The regiments behind him were shouting, "Long live the Emperor!" This meeting only delayed Napoleon a few minutes. He continued on his way. The Emperor, surrounded only by his 120 lancers, thus reached Paris. He entered by the Barrière de Fontainebleau, took the large avenue of trees which is on the left, the Boulevard Dim Montparnasse, the other boulevards to the Invalides, then the Pont du La Concorde, the quay along the river, and the gate of the Louvre. At 8:15 in the evening he was at the Tuileries.